Our friend Sam Chin, who was our first pastoral intern in the spring of 2010, has now finished his seminary training. He's married. He's finished year one of his chaplaincy education, and so he was commissioned as an official Cooperative Baptist Fellowship endorsed chaplain. He is starting year 2 at Grady Hospital, which is that wonderful hospital in downtown Atlanta that is so important that they built I-75 and 85 around it. That worst curve in downtown Atlanta, the one that you're always afraid you're going to get rear-ended in the middle of, is the Grady curve. It goes around Grady Hospital. As you're driving through there the next time, ask a passenger in your vehicle to look out the passenger window and up, and that is the location of Grady Hospital. Drivers, keep your eyes on the road in the Grady curve. Today is also Religious Liberty Sunday, one of those times when we pause and acknowledge the service of those who have made it possible for us to gather here in freedom, without coercion, without threat of violence. We gather here freely. I want to acknowledge especially Captain Select John Duenas of the United States Navy. He didn't know I was going to do this. My brother-in-law John and our entire family are here, and we've been praying for John, and he's doing well. They are now stationed at Scott Air Force Base just outside of St. Louis. Were y'all at Scott? Yeah, I thought so. So y'all could compare notes. Not you, Dad, your neighbor. Yes. Dad, you never lived at Scott Air Force Base. Okay, all right, we're in agreement on that. But I know there are many, in addition to my brother-in-law John, who have served in the armed services, and we want to acknowledge you today. Those of you who have served in defense of our freedoms, would you please stand so that we might acknowledge you again this day? Today is Religious Liberty Sunday, a day that in the life of our church and many others like ours, we set aside to remember and to give thanks for these freedoms, and especially that we are able to assemble here for worship. The passage that you've just heard read a moment ago comes from Acts chapter 19, and in this passage there are at least 4 good lessons, 4 important words for us, for those of us who are Christians living in such a time as this. Because this is the story of a new faith making inroads into a location that is accustomed to an old faith. Doesn't that ring a bell? This is a new faith, namely called sometimes the Way. In some locations, its adherents have started to be called Christians. We refer to them sometimes as Jesus followers. They are new in the city of Ephesus. And the local religious groups of Ephesus are having to make space in their minds and in their hearts, in their city, for this new faith, and they are struggling with it. In fact, as we heard read a moment ago, there are in fact cries within the public sphere calling for the existing faith to interfere, calling for the existing faith, the older faith, to outlaw the new faith, even violently if need be. Doesn't that sound familiar? Today, we find ourselves living at a time when there are competing definitions of the phrase religious liberty. There is a new definition of that phrase. It goes something like this: religious liberty means relegating new or smaller faiths to certain areas so that the dominant faith can exercise the freedoms to which it is accustomed. That's the new definition. And if I am painfully honest, I will tell you that there are times when that new definition feels quite comfortable to me. There are times when it feels safer to me to wrap myself in the cloak of this new definition of religious liberty. At this day and time, it happens to suit my preferences. But there's a classic definition of religious liberty. And these two are at odds with one another. The classic definition of religious liberty or religious freedom goes something like this. Religious freedom means that in a moral society, the dominant religion will protect and ensure the rights of smaller and newcomer faiths, even if they differ. That is the American definition. That is the Baptist definition. That is the true definition of religious liberty, regardless of the comfort that I may take in the new definition. So today, from Acts chapter 19, I'd like to find at least 4 lessons on religious liberty. The first one is this: we as Baptists have been the newcomers. We have been the newcomers and are still to this day. If anyone needs to understand this fact, it's this church. Georgetown Baptist Church, of anyone and everyone, must understand this historic principle. We are the downtown church of the town founded by the Baptist leader, the Reverend Elijah Craig, who was imprisoned and fined for preaching without license by the official state religion of Virginia, which at the time included Kentucky. It was the Baptists of Virginia who struck a bargain with James Madison himself to ensure that when the fledgling nation finally passed a constitution, there would be a Bill of Rights disestablishing state religion and replacing it with freedom of religion. In other words, without the Baptists of this state, faith in America wouldn't look the way we have known it to look. We have been the newcomers. Roger Williams, Isaac Backus, John Leland, and many others were newcomers in colonies and then in an early republic that favored established religion, and they suffered the consequences. They suffered through the struggle until the freedoms were assured that we enjoy today. We have been the newcomers, and so we are still to this day. The best example of how we are still newcomers is that the place geographically where Christianity is growing the fastest is in the South. I don't mean Monticello. I don't mean Georgia. I don't even mean Florida. When I say the South, I mean the Southern Hemisphere. In Africa and South America, the Christian faith is growing faster than anywhere else in the world, so much so that our neighbors at Georgetown College are setting aside a conference this coming January to study and celebrate this phenomenon. In the Southern Hemisphere, the Christian faith and the Baptist expression of it are the new kid on the block. And it is only when the established and older religion in those areas are gracious to us that our faith is able to grow, at least openly. We can tell and celebrate the story of the underground church and its flourishing at another time. In such places where old and new, established and small faiths are trying to find a voice in the public sphere, there is a collision of cultures. We have been the newcomer, and we are still yet to this day. Second lesson from Acts chapter 19. Losing the home field advantage is a real change and a hard adjustment. We need to acknowledge the human element of this struggle. We've spoken of this many times, privately, publicly, in worship, in fellowship. the world feels different than it used to. And I'm not talking about those easy lines that can be drawn in the sand. I'm not talking about anyone in this room trying to return to something that we all universally understand as an evil or as something lesser than what we should live for. We're not talking about reestablishing the good old days of Jim Crow or separate entrances or separate water fountains or any sort of systematized hatred. That's not what we're talking about. But even in my lifetime, I can remember before cultural and civic changes began to shape our society in different ways. Before ball games were scheduled for Sunday morning. Before Little League practices were scheduled for Sunday morning. Before tournaments were routinely over top of the Lord's Day. Before all businesses, except for one mighty chicken fryer, stayed open on Sunday. It was a different time then, wasn't it? We rested, or at least we had an opportunity to do so, we being many, if not most of us. Civic expression was different then too. I can remember when the school program that was scheduled for the middle of December looked and sounded different than it does today. We've lost the home field advantage. Actually, we still have it, but pieces of it are being stripped away as Christian civic culture no longer has a hold on society's norms. And so the experience that we are seeing today, this response of angst, is in fact a timeless one. Look with me again at Acts chapter 19, beginning at verse 29. At the reaction of a society of an old established religion struggling to understand the newcomer, here's how they reacted. Verse 28. When they heard this, they were enraged and shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." The city was filled with the confusion. The people rushed together to the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's travel companions. Paul wished to go into the crowd, but the disciples wouldn't let him. Even some officials of the province of Asia who were friendly to him sent him a message urging him not to go to the theater. Meanwhile, some were shouting one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Some of the crowd gave instructions to Alexander, whom the Jews had pushed forward. Alexander motioned for silence and tried to make a defense before the people, but when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours, all of them shouted in unison, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Ours is not the first society to struggle with the prospect of losing the home field advantage and experiencing the arrival of a newcomer faith. Third lesson from Acts 19. Panic does not help. Rushing about, shouting, dragging people, attacking one another. Panic does not help. Neither does talking louder, pushing, coercing, manipulating, stomping our feet, blaming our elders for failing to instill values, blaming our young people for failing to receive values, scapegoating government officials, withdrawing inward, insulating ourselves, or crying out, "Jesus, take the wheel." None of that panic mentality helps all that much. Verse 35. An official of the people steps forward. When the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, "Citizens of Ephesus, who is there that does not know that the city of the Ephesians is the temple keeper of the great Artemis and of the statue that fell from heaven? Since these things cannot be denied, y'all ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. You've brought these men here who are neither temple robbers nor blasphemers of our goddess. If therefore Demetrius and the artisans with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges there against one another. If there's anything further you want to know, it must be settled in the regular assembly. For we're in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there's no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. And when he had said this, he dismissed the assembly. Just as an aside, I'm going to guess that that elected official was not the most popular man in Ephesus that day. But he knew. What does panic accomplish? But to reveal our worst nature. What does panic accomplish but to harm our own witness and drive a wedge, perhaps between sister and brother in Christ? What does panic do but to harm the greater civic good? No. Fourth lesson from Acts 19. It is courage and conversation that provide a path forward. It takes courage to stand in while everyone else is panicked. It takes courage to sit down for conversation when everyone else is shouting. Last week, we arrived in Greensboro to represent the church at the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship meeting. We got there early enough in the evening that we wanted to get settled in, but we had missed dinner, and so we had a gift card to a chain restaurant. I tell you that point because I want you to understand we didn't go to one of the places that the youth would eat on a mission trip. You know, this was not anything brave like they go on their mission trips. We went to the Olive Garden. We had a gift card. We went to the Olive Garden, and we walked in, and we were seated, and I began to look around, and there was something about my experience of being in that room that felt different. It felt odd, and it took me a few moments to put my finger on it, and then finally I realized, and I probably made some people uncomfortable because I kept looking around at the room, at all the servers and all the employees up front, and at all the other tables and the folks that were having dinner. I'm sure they thought I was a crazy Kentuckian staring at everybody. And finally, it struck me what it was that felt so unusual. As I looked around the room that day, I realized I was in the minority. Probably 35 to 40% of the gathering that day was Anglo. And looked and acted and made life decisions the way that I do, if you're following me. And so as I looked around from table to table, I saw any number of different types of families, any number of different types of groups who were out celebrating or just having dinner as we were. I saw all ages and ethnicities and genders and backgrounds and life choices. They were all there in a wide array. That wasn't the unusual part. That's happened thousands of times in my life. I used to live in Atlanta and New Orleans. What struck me as such a strange experience was the contrast between what we encountered in the city of Greensboro at that random Olive Garden versus the event we were in town to participate in. Because the group that was gathered at the hotel, not even a quarter of a mile away, just on the other side of the interstate, was 90+% Anglo. They look just like me. They act just like me. It was jarring to walk from one world into the other and back. And then to hear a conference that talked about a big tent and openness and progressivism and all sorts of grand ideas. our world is not only changing, it has changed. The home field advantage is no longer what it once was. If we are to have a credible witness, we will need courage. Verse 22, as chaos is breaking loose in the city of Ephesus, Paul sent two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia, while he himself stayed for some time longer. He had the courage to stay in the game as the home field advantage was coming unraveled all around him. It takes courage to be the newcomer. It takes courage to be the old-timer that is making space. But it also is an opportunity for conversation. Conversation with other newcomers. In verse 30, this is the approach that the Apostle Paul tries to take. He wished to go into the crowd. There's a mob running through the streets, railing against the newcomer faith, and he wants to go talk to these people. Doesn't that fit the pattern that we've seen over the last several months of Paul's approach to his mission? He would start out going into a city and he would visit the place where Jewish folk would gather for fellowship and for worship. And he would share his heart with other people who were Jewish folk, just like he was, only he also had come to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And he wanted to share that he had become a Jesus follower and did not consider that incompatible with being Jewish. But as we saw a couple weeks ago when he was in Athens, he also took on another approach. The longer he went into his ministry, he would step away from the Jewish gathering place and go into public settings and speak with anybody, non-Jewish folk included, Gentile folk like you and me. And then he went back to Jerusalem, as we saw in Acts chapter 15, and he stood up. And in so many words, delivered the message, these people are every bit as much the Jesus follower as you and I. He entered into conversation with people of the dominant faith and other newcomer faiths everywhere that he went. One conversation that needs to happen is conversation with those other folks. These people groups, these backgrounds that dominate the evening news and the morning paper day after day after day need no longer to be simply labels. They need to be people with names and faces in our neighborhoods. They are here. Let us have the courage to have conversation despite the change in the home field advantage. And there's a conversation that needs to happen with the Lord. There's two people I want to ask you to pray for today. We need to have conversation with the Lord in support of these folks. In addition to praying for the persecuted church, in addition for praying for all religious peoples worldwide who are being persecuted, let us also pray for the servants whom God has raised and appointed to stand with them and for them. First person I want to introduce you to is a gentleman by the name of Knox. Knox Thames was several years ahead of me at Georgetown College. He serves now as the Special Advisor for Religious Minorities in the Near East and South Central Asia. Whew, I'm worn out just reading his title. Let me let y'all hear that again. Special Advisor for Religious Minorities in the Near East and South Central Asia. I forgot to say, with the United States State Department. So, the last project that Knox worked on, he just got back from addressing the European Parliament on, quote, the need for greater transatlantic cooperation to defend religious freedom, end quote. Meaning, we need to work together to protect the newcomers and the weaker people groups who are being oppressed worldwide for their faith. That's not just a good neighborly thing to do. It protects the places where we are still the newcomer. Please pray for Knox in his work, his family in Virginia, and people like him. The second name I want to ask you to pray for is buddy of mine named Daniel Glaze. Daniel and I were classmates next door at Georgetown College. Pray for him and the rest of the board of the Baptist Joint Committee as they are seeking to replace Brent Walker, who has been the director of the Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs, the most important voice in Washington, D.C., standing up for religious freedom. Let me say that again. The Baptist Joint Committee is the most important voice in Washington, D.C., standing in defense of religious freedom, and they're looking for a new leader right now. Please pray for Daniel and his colleagues as they are seeking this person. People like Daniel and Knox are critically important because these people and people like them protect us, protect humanity, protect people of faith from the worst version of ourselves. That version of me that wants to wrap the cloak of comfortable isolationism around me and lash out at whatever is different, especially when it strips away at my home field advantage. It's the Daniel and Knoxes of the world who put an arm around my shoulders and say, breathe, have courage, have conversation with your neighbors. In closing, let me say once again, we as Baptists, we as this particular congregation must recognize the difference and remember. This is so important that it's one of only 2 issues that I can tell you that both of our primary ministry partners, the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship and the Southern Baptist Convention, actually agree on. That's miraculous. They agree on this. They have both stated their agreement within the last 2 weeks at their respective annual meetings that we need to reject this new definition of religious liberty. It's not only un-American, it's un-Christ-like. Let us have the courage to keep playing, even if the home field advantage has been stripped away. And let us be in conversation with the Holy One, praying for those who are being oppressed and praying for those who are standing up against religious intolerance, those who are standing for religious freedom. And let us have conversation with my neighbors from the Olive Garden. They seemed like really nice people. Who do I know at any one of those other tables? Who do I know at any one of those other posts or in any one of those other chairs? Lord, help me pull up a chair for conversation with my sister, with my brother, made in the image of God, within God's grand and wondrous creation. If that sounds like a faith to which you need to respond with your life, we want to give you an opportunity to do so today. If you're ready to say yes to Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord, to accept and follow in the footsteps of Christ, to abide in Him, then as we sing this next song of response, would you step forward from where you are and let your decision be known? If you know that these friends, these sisters and brothers have become home for you and you're ready, we would love to receive you as a member of Georgetown Baptist Church. If you're looking for ways that you can respond with action, with generosity, then we want to let you do that today. As we sing this next song, if you're ready to respond to the work of the Holy One in your life, won't you come? We stand and we sing in hopes that you will.